Hi, everyone. Welcome to all of you attending today's event. I am Lalita Duperon. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for South Asia at Stanford. I would like to start with recognizing that Stanford is an occupier of the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma-Ohlone tribe. We are grateful to be guests on this land and commit to solidarity to Indigenous struggles. I want to thank our co-sponsors today, the Markaz Resource Center, the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies, and the Clayman Institute for Gender Research, with particular shout outs to my friends and colleagues, Abia Ahmed, Farah El Sharif, and Simrat Mataru. Just a point of housekeeping, please put your questions in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. There will be time for audience questions at the end of today's event, but feel free to put your question in anytime. Now, I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Rafia Zakaria. She is the author of The Upstairs Wife, An Intimate History of Pakistan, and Veil, as well as essays for, among many others, The Guardian, CNN, and the New York Times Book Review. She is a regular columnist for Dawn in Pakistan and the Baffler in the United States. But today we are going to talk about her new book, Against White Feminism, Notes on Disruption. In the book, Rafia combines stories of her personal experiences as a woman of color and as a lawyer, writer, and former board member of Amnesty International, with research about how whiteness and its privileges have negatively shaped the lives of millions of women over the past century. The book is fantastic and not always a comfortable read, and I'm just delighted that Rafia is able to speak with us today. Joining us to discuss the book with our speaker is my friend and colleague Usha Iyer, Assistant Professor of Film and Media Studies at Stanford. Usha Iyer's research and teaching interests lie at the intersection of cinema, performance, and gender and sexuality studies. They are the author of Dancing Women, Choreographing Corporeal Histories of Hindi Cinema, and their next book project is an examination of the effective engagements of Caribbean spectators with Indian cinema in relation to discourses of belonging and citizenship. I have been looking forward to today's conversation for months, and so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rafia Zakaria.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for inviting me to speak today. I wanted to begin the discussion today with noting some definitional terms, right? When you essentially see a book called Against White Feminism, and I have gotten this pushback a lot from people. When you see that title, I think the first thing that people will think is that I'm against white feminists. But one of the most crucial terms to remember as we have our discussion today is that I am speaking about whiteness and not white as a skin color. So in that sense, I mean whiteness, which I call, which I describe as have played and is essentially the racial privilege that is attached to being white and which plays a universalizing role in terms of white feminist concerns, agendas, beliefs, etc. So by this, I mean that, you don't have to be white to be a white feminist, right? Brown people and even Black people, Asian people can uphold the values of whiteness, re-entrench the centrality of being white. And so, it's when I say against white feminism, what I'm saying is that I'm against feminists who want to essentially continue to maintain a white-centric history of feminism, a white-centric agenda setting in feminism, and a refusal to recognize the differences, particularly the intersectional nature of feminism. Now, that was like a lot of academic speak. What I'm basically saying here, and what was the central frustration that led to this book, is simply that, all around me, I saw white women being hailed as pioneers, as breakers of the glass ceiling, as women who had spearheaded the suffrage movement and other movements after that. And it left me with questions about why there were no other women represented in the history of feminism. And the simple example that I'll give you guys is, the waves, right? So the first wave, second wave, third wave, fourth wave feminism, as we know it, and which anyone who's ever taken a gender studies class or looked at the Wikipedia entries on feminism will encounter, that kind of separation, historical epochs of feminism, so to speak. And they're all centered around the achievements of white women, the glorification of white women, and consequently of whiteness. So the project of this book is to try to excise whiteness from feminism, so that the challenge I set myself and that I set you as readers of the book is, is to imagine a feminism that does not center whiteness. I don't have to tell you that the vast majority of women around the world today are brown, Black, and Asian. And yet it is the concerns, policy setting, priorities of white feminists that dominate the movement. So that is what I set out to do. And the reason I set out to do it is actually very simple. It is the fact that beyond, if you're not speaking to white feminists, if you're not in the white Western world, and you ask women about whether they're feminists or not, they're going to say no. So I think even approaching this book as, against white feminism, white feminists tend to, be very, very offended sometimes by what I'm saying, because they imagine the movement as it exists today as meeting the needs of all women. And what I have found is that the vast majority of the world's women have already written off feminism as a concept that is relevant to them. So when I set out to write this book, I saw it in some ways as also as a last ditch effort, right? I felt that, look, feminism is on life support everywhere around the world. It is not considered a viable concept, mostly because women around the world see being feminist, in a performative sense, being feminist as also acting white. And while they may be interested in, in the ideas of feminism, which I would define as like the struggle for justice and equality for all people who are discriminated, but especially women, they very much see the relevance of that concept. But when they look at the movement and who's leading it, they see a bunch of celebrities. They see women who are multimillionaires. They see essentially, or they see, suburban women from the suburbs of the United States, all of them, marching off to Women's March. And none of those women bear any resemblance to them. And not only do they not bear resemblance, there's also a seemingly willful ignorance of the fact that other women might have different agendas and priorities. There's a self-satisfaction and smugness to white feminism that I think really, really turns off all other feminists. So those were the challenges that I saw, essentially hanging on, essentially being almost like parasitic to the movement, right? Taking away from it rather than adding to it. Now, I personally am a feminist. I'm a Muslim feminist, and 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 essentially, I put in the book all the different times when I not only felt excluded, but I actually felt infantilized and condescended to, right? And that feeling of being condescended to is one that permeates interactions of white feminists with any or, brown, Black, Asian women. And I feel that if feminism is to sort of be reconstructed in a more just and egalitarian way, then the first step is, of course, recognizing the problem itself. And so, this book essentially tries to outline the problem. I won't go into the details, but I do want to give a couple of examples that kind of show what I mean, right? By condescension or by not including brown, Black, etc., women in policy discussions. One is the example of clean stoves in India, right? So this clean stoves project was a development aid project. It was run by the UN along with like literally tons of other NGOs who are collaborating with them to run this million-dollar project, whose entire goal was to replace the stoves that rural women in India, in Rajasthan, used, and give them these efficient, clean stoves. And in the sort of run up to the program, this is something that lasted almost a decade, right? So it's a huge program. And before it went into operation, the idea was like, this is a win-win thing. The burning of the stoves that women are using burn wood, that makes the house smoky, leads to smoke inhalation. The wood that is used also, comes from nearby forests, so it has an environmental impact. So essentially, when those stoves aren't used anymore, then you're going to reduce the carbon footprint. Anyway, so this is the huge, great plan. And what they did is that they went to India and they went to Rajasthan and they told the women, look, here are some amazing clean stoves that we're going to give you for free. And once you have them, then you'll save so much time because you don't have to go out looking for firewood. The home and the hearth will be so much more healthy and so much more just essentially have clean air. And so they went and they distributed thousands of stoves. Now when they came back, and to add one more little idea of why they were saying these stoves are going to be so great, was that once these women have time, so these stoves were also considered a way of empowering women. And the logic for that was, once they have these stoves, and then they're going to save so much time because it won't take as much time to cook their food. And then when they have time, they can apply for other jobs, and then they'll have they'll become wage earners. And when these women become wage earners, then they'll have more of an opportunity to, more decision making power, essentially, in the home. So now they go and, they go back to see how this great, fantastic plan that was essentially going to free Rajasthani women from poverty through their stoves, how it was working out. And when they went there, they were shocked to find that most of the women, I mean, they kept the stoves, they kept them, but they weren't using them. They were still using the wood burning stoves that they, had always used. So they asked them, why are you still using this, dirty stove instead of this great stove that we've given you? And the women said, look, first of all, this stove that you've given me keeps breaking and I can't fix it. This other stove, I make this stove, so I know exactly how it works. But then they also said, look, I enjoy going out to collect firewood for my stove. That is the time that all of us women gather without any men around. And that is, my recreation, essentially, for the day. And then third, they said that, there were many traditional utensils that they had been using for literally generations and generations that could not be used on the new stove. And finally, they said, we don't care about the free time. We care about the fact that this home and hearth should always be the, warm and at the center of the household. And even if we did start using the clean stoves, and we had all this extra time, we would not want to become wage earners, because the only jobs we can get over here in rural Rajasthan is to break rocks at some construction site in the heat. And we just don't want to do that. So this example, and it was devised, this whole clean stove program was devised largely by white people, mostly white women. And it involved this huge expenditure. And and the one thing that everybody seemed to have just forgotten to do is actually to talk to these women themselves. And the consequence was that, it was assumed that the white women who, white women, as well as the brown NGO class that we are all familiar with in South Asia, that essentially acts as facilitators for the plans that white women make in other parts of the world and apply them to India. Nobody had ever bothered to talk to the Rajasthani women themselves, because if they had, they would have told them these very basic things. The fact that they're, it's rural Rajasthan is not like rural New Jersey, where you can go apply for a job at the Wendy's or the Burger King. There's, there aren't, like they said, the only option is construction out on a site. But the reason why I present this example is because it is a great case that highlights how this is done again and again and again. This is one example, but in the book, I include many, many more examples that essentially show how people who are poor, particularly women who are poor and brown or Black or Asian, are almost infantilized in the discourse of, being the white feminist savior. in that they're assumed to have like these simplistic needs, you know, where like, oh my God, if we give them a chicken, or if we give them a stove, or if we go give them a sewing machine, they're all going to somehow, you know, they're all somehow going to have their lives transformed, because that's how simplistic their lives are. But of course, you know, it's, you know, we impute complexity to another person's being when we understand them as equals. When we are when we look at infantilize them, we are imagining them as simpler creatures, you know, who don't have all the preferences, all the you know, all the complex dimensions of thought that exist in our own lives. I mean, you know, you'll never hear anyone saying, oh, let's, you know, go to suburban, you know, suburban LA, or, you know, suburban Virginia, and these women have problems, they're sad or whatever, and we're all going to give them a teapot, and this teapot is, it's going to make them happy, they can look at it and be happy, it also has a function, you can pour tea, they can be, no, that's never ever done, because white women are understood as multidimensional complex beings, whereas Indian women, the women in Rajasthan, are imagined as like these, you know, simple little women who just need a stove, a clean stove. And so, you know, when I looked at example after example of this, you start thinking, you know, because when you see one example, when I started out my research and you see one example, you think, oh, you know, this is one example, and maybe there were blunders, you know, maybe this was just a mistake, and then they recognized the mistake, and then they started to amend the mistake. But if you look at development literature, or if you even look at people talking about mission trips and things like that, particularly white women talking about this, you see that that there's no effort. I mean, that this is happening again and again and again in project after project after project. You know, this was clean stoves. Bill Gates came up with his magic project where he was going to give chickens to poor women, and they were going to get empowered. And even that, you know, the word empowerment is you know, is it has been rendered, sort of has been made into a fuzzword, where it's understood as like this technocratic neoliberal term, instead of anything having political significance. But I go into more detail in the book. Concluding point in this example was that, you know, when you see this happening again and again and again, you start to realize that the aim of these projects and these interventions is not success. So when they're running this huge program for clean stoves, they don't actually expect that these clean stoves are going to be used and they'll cause actual transformation. The goal is simply to collect moral currency, because when donating NGOs or countries do this, they are seen as altruistic and benevolent. And the people who get the aid, the women who get the aid, are considered dependent and essentially not essentially stupid, you know, because they don't know, and because they don't know what's best for them. So when I started to see this happen repeatedly, you know, that made me terribly angry. It made me so angry because, you know, the West, when it's giving this money, you know, and providing this aid, imagines it can attach a dollar amount to what they've donated and what they've sent. And that dollar amount, again, is like the currency of having moral supremacy. And white feminism is all about white feminist moral supremacy. in that the white woman is central, she is good, she knows what's best for all other women. And, and that sort of moral white feminist supremacy allows for this system to continue in all different parts of, whether it's the book goes into whether you're talking about sexuality, whether you're talking about history, whether you're talking about the media, all of these sorts of different sectors involve, I essentially deconstruct how essentially white feminist saviordom controls the dynamics and the terms of exchange and conversation and interaction. But until we start, really working on dismantling these assumptions, the possibility of a truly intersectional feminist, global feminist conversation is impossible. So so I'm going to stop here with, because I know that there are a lot of questions. Usha has some. I'm hoping you all have some. And so I'll hand it over.
Thanks so much, Rafia, for introducing those who might not have read Against White Feminism as yet to the kind of main contours of the book. I did want to start off by saying that it was a delight to hear your book. I heard an audiobook version because that's been my pandemic mode of listening to books and walking. And I'd often find myself laughing out aloud or screaming, yes. I felt
That's
good. And I think part of that was I loved the tone of the book. I was delighting in the snark of the book.
Not me snarky? No.
And I think there's the kind of tonal qualities of talking back in the book are really important. And I wanted to kind of ask a first question about that. There has been a lot of work on women of color feminisms, on transnational feminisms, both within the academy and in organizing spaces, on decolonial feminism, Black feminism. I think your book is in the space of popular writing, and it has been very popular. So it does a certain kind of work and has a very wide audience. And we were interested in kind of thinking about that in the space of the academy as well, to not have these kind of discrete categories of academic and popular writing, but to think about what this writing does. And we'll talk a little bit more about the other books that have come out in this space as well. But the tone of your book Against White Feminism kind of is talking back not just to these intellectual frameworks of white feminism, but to also the tonal qualities of white feminism. Like you said, this condescending, supercilious, lecturing, I know what's good for you kind of tone. So maybe we can start from there. If you could take us through the kind of affective, emotional states that you were in when you conceived of the book, when you were writing the book, and who do you imagine as the audience for the book?
That's an excellent question. I think that, that the tone is intentional because I wanted to, as best as I could as an author, to use, as you said, talk back and use the same tone that I've heard my whole life, right? And so, and there was an acknowledgement. I mean, obviously, this book is more perhaps blunt than a lot of other, a lot of other work, excellent work that's being done on the subject. But as I mentioned, it came from a place of just being fed up. Like I just got to a point where like I just had, and you can't present a whole book. I was in so many conversations where I would experience this kind of, either condescension or, just a sort of very superficial kind of inclusion. And when you are in those or basically just when you are in the midst of a microaggression, right? Like the ones I talk about in the book, where someone tells you, oh, you're Pakistani, better, can you come to my party in your exotic clothes, right? Because they're fetishizing you. Like in that moment, you just don't know what to do. I didn't know what to do, or like what kind of snarky retort I could come up with, in that moment. I was never able to come up with anything. And then of course you go home, and then like it's just playing in an endless loop in your head. And this book is the endless loop in my head, because when I sat down, I could put all of those, both the emotions of it, and the emotions of it, as well as the frustration of it, into words. In terms of academia versus popular writing, I mean, I honestly think that there's just incredible work being done on this in academia. And but I felt that work was not really accessible to people out, in the popular world. A lot of these things, I was, I studied in graduate school, studying political philosophy. But, I couldn't, within academia, I wasn't able to sort of have, the complete freedom to write a book like this. And so I was very, very grateful. I, like I told you, earlier, I didn't believe that this book would get published until it was physically in my hands. And that is because there was a fairly small window of time, I would say, before and after the murder of George Floyd, where there was some interest in a racial reckoning. And that's when I sold the book to a publisher. But, I was just tired of being gaslit. And, in this book is like my present to people, so that, especially brown, Black, and Asian feminists who constantly feel that way. But it's also for white feminists, or white women rather. And the reason it is for white women is that, you and me, Usha, we can like talk about this endlessly, right? We've experienced it, we continue to experience it, etc. But for there to be any actual change, white women need to talk to other white women about these issues, because that conversation can be far more instrumental in breaking down these stereotypes than anything I could do. So there's definitely hope in that, because I do think, I mean, the team, my editor was white, my editor in the UK was white. So it's undoubted that there are white women who are committed to who acknowledge this and are committed to it. So yeah, that's who I wrote the book for.
And I think you go to great pain in the book. I kept wondering if there was pressure to do it, or you're just anticipating the pushback where you have to keep saying not all white feminists, and not everyone who's white and a feminist is a white feminist.
Yeah, I mean, I have a Substack called Rafia Unedited, where I'm saying all the stuff, but it was important for me to say not all white women, and it was important for me. It was also important for me to understand and to explain that, at least in my case, I know a lot of brown women who are white feminists. I really do. And there are a lot of advantages, if you're willing to play that role, because then you're the good brown or the good Black, and you're going to affirm all these notions of white feminism. And, some of my biggest attackers have followed, exactly that route, where they are brown women. And you can see that, they've been instrumentalized by by white women who kind of are like, oh, well, she's brown, so she can say this to her. And, it's like, no, there are plenty of brown racist people. And there are plenty of brown women who aspire to white feminism.
Absolutely. I had a question that I was going to come to later, but since we're here, I did want to ask you about positionality in terms of other factors like class, which you definitely mentioned, middle class white women, but also middle and upper class women, other women, and the question of caste and religion, which, coming from South Asia, since both of us do come originally from South Asia, these are really important considerations where I have quite a few South Asian friends who I would kind of think of as white feminists because they might often be dominant caste, as I am, or upper middle class, etc. And so I wanted to ask you if we see a similar play of caste and class, say in India or Pakistan, where each of us grew up, and what critiques of these feminisms are taking place today. For example, I know in India, there is a lot of kind of Dalit feminist pushback against what is called Savarna feminism. So that, the point is not as much about the point that is being made that it's not about identity as much as it is about your politics. And that's a well-taken point, but clearly a lot of work needs to be undertaken by those with privilege, whether it's class, caste, race privilege, to dismantle the identities into which we are born, right? And to embrace a different politics, to be, for example, a caste traitor or a traitor to the privilege that you're born to be a strong ally. So since you began on that point, maybe we could continue with that.
Yes, I think that, the central kind of critique of this book is that even people who mean well can be complicit in the oppression of others. I mean, if I had to put, the book into one sentence, that's what I would say, is that even well-meaning, well-intentioned people can become complicit in technologies of oppression. And it can happen to anyone. And the real challenge, of course, is to confront that. I'm not about to say that I don't have white privilege because I'm not white. But I have, at this point in my life, I have class privilege. I mean, there's times where I've, as I talk about in the book, where I've been desperately poor, but so in recognizing what I'm asking of white women, which is, like you said, be traitors to their own privilege, I also think that is something that should be demanded from the women in any dominant group anywhere. So yes, absolutely, the women in dominant caste groups in India have a duty to, it's very like, I'm saying it in a sentence, but I recognize how difficult it is. In the case of white women, for instance, their self-image is very tied up in looking at themselves as victims, right? Victims who have overcome all these challenges and won all these rights. So to tell them that, you might not have won all of those because you're that awesome. I mean, some part of it is because you're awesome, but another part of it is because you're white, and they'd rather share power with you than with a Black woman. And I would say the same thing, in Pakistan, I would say class, right? I would say the same thing to wealthy feminists in Pakistan, is that, they too see themselves as victims because they're women and it is a grossly patriarchal society. And then to tell them that you're complicit in the oppression of other women who are poor, it doesn't go over well. But I think that if we as women are to, redefine what it means, what solidarity means, for instance. I mean, at this point, solidarity doesn't exist. Like, it's a imaginary concept, but it can exist. And it requires that sort of self-analysis on the part of all feminists, and that I think is sort of one of the universalizing impetus within feminism, which is that we all have to engage in this self-analysis, recognize where we are privileged, and then act responsibly with that privilege, so that we are not using it to oppress other people, women.
Absolutely. And you'd mentioned this kind of moment in which your book got picked up, a moment of what is called the racial reckoning. And we've had other books in this space more recently, like Mickey Kendall's Hood Feminism, and more recently, Kyla Sculler's The Trouble with White Women, which also discuss white feminism versus or against Black feminism, women of color feminisms. Many of them have a kind of particular focus on the West and on the US. And Against White Feminism mobilizes very deliberately an international perspective in its critique of white feminism. So many of the chapters are kind of bringing in perspective, say, from Afghanistan, from elsewhere in South Asia, from Africa, etc. And this can often get left out of many of these critiques of white feminism as well, right? We know that US foreign policy, popular journalism, even academia can be willfully ignorant of global issues in the US. Whereas your book has a deep personal stake in what the US does in the rest of the world. So one, militarily, culturally, economically, all of that, it kind of connects the racist underpinnings of white feminism here and elsewhere in the rest of the world, in the global South, all of these terms that we might use to describe it. How would you say your own background brings these particular perspectives to the book? Because as you were talking about building solidarities and thinking about complicity, but also the kind of work we have to do to build these solidarities, we bring certain histories. So it would really help for the audience to hear the kind of histories that you're bringing to the writing of this book.
Yes, it is, there isn't any good way to sidestep what I'm trying to say in this book. And what I'm trying to say in this book is that white women are going to have to cede some space. And the problem with that idea is that there are too many white women who don't realize how much space they're taking up. And such that, even the expert on how brown women are being oppressed, one of the authors that you said is a white woman. And and I feel that all of that comes from this belief that if it comes from this very careerist and kind of individualized idea of success, right? So I'm a white feminist academic. I'm going to write on the topic of how, like how brown women are suffering. And there's no questioning of whether, you have the right to do that. And the reason I point this out is that even now, the mainstream assumption is that white women can write about everything and brown women can write about brown women. At best, they can write about brown, Black, Asian, minority women, right? And even among the most well-meaning white feminists, I see a big reticence when they're confronted about the idea that someone else might be more legitimate in writing about a certain topic than they are, right? There's like a knee-jerk anger reaction to that, but that is the problem, there is an assumption that if white women don't do it, if they're not the leaders, if they're not leading the project, if they're not, head of the committee, then it's just all going to fall apart. There's this, it's such a pervasive worldview. And I came across this. So, for listeners, who haven't read the book, I came to the US when I was 18. I was married to someone who was 12 years older than me. I had an arranged marriage. And then when I was about 24, I, essentially ran away. And I was a single mom, and I went through law school, and, then started to work with a civil rights law firm, and also pursue my PhD in political philosophy. So that's like the, in a nutshell, version. But then one of the things I got to do in 2009, I had been working on these issues for a while, was to get on the board of Amnesty International USA, which overall is an excellent organization. I encourage everybody to join. But what I found so suddenly I'm like the very first, Pakistani American woman to ever be on the board of, the largest advocacy organization in the world. And what I found was that theoretically they wanted me to be on the board, right? And give my input or whatever. But really, instrumentally, they didn't want me to be on the board. And I discovered that through the fact that, for instance, I was repeatedly set up to fail. Right in my first week, or first couple of weeks that I was on the board, I was given a task that I could not possibly do by myself, right? And then it was like, oh, well, if you can't handle this, then I suppose you can't be head of this committee, and you can't do this. So point being is, and on an individual level, if you talk to the women who would do this, white women, who were the majority on the board, they would say, oh, no, I'm not excluding her because she's brown. I'm excluding her because she's just like incompetent, which was ridiculous, right? I mean, they wouldn't even say incompetent. They would say something like, her skills don't match the skill set for this. But when I saw that happen again, the first few times you kind of say, okay, yeah, I have a lot to learn, no doubt. But like in the 5th year of being on the board, you see people, who you see people have like just been there for, 6 months, and they're being given, positions that are powerful and will create. I mean, point being for all of this story that I'm telling is that there is a token acceptance by now, because white society has become self-conscious of its own whiteness, and so there's a effort to be inclusive, diverse, et cetera, and then but there is an unwillingness to allow systemic change, which should be the purpose of inclusion. The purpose of inclusion is not just, we'll keep the menu the same, and then you can sit on a little stool on the side over there, and maybe we'll give you some food. That's where inclusion is at right now. It's not a seat at the table. It's a stool in the corner. And, but and my book is essentially arguing for a push so that becomes an actual seat at the table, that becomes an actual say on the menu, and I mean, it feels like a very uphill battle, but my experiences that I had, when I was practicing law. The job I did, as I write about in the book, was as a lawyer in a domestic violence shelter. So I had a lot of hands-on experience of actual, frontline issues in feminism. And in that, I would say that that the situation is dire. The shelters are full right now. They are full, and the majority of women in them are of racial minorities. And COVID has imposed a tremendous burden. And one of the things you learn from being in a shelter is that, every moment, this moment right now, you're sitting in front of me, I'm, answering questions about this book, but there are people whose entire lives are unraveling. And the feminist movement needs to have urgent responses to what's happening. And we don't. And the reason that we don't is because we have this huge elephant in the room. We have this huge elephant that we, too many people are ardently committed, to deny its presence. And when you have that, then of course, like, you start to dither. I mean, people say, oh, you're dividing feminism. Interestingly, Hillary Clinton was asked about my book in an interview she did on Guardian Politics. And, for those of you who are interested, I encourage you to listen to it, right? Because it's the most classic technocratic, neoliberal, white feminist response to the arguments in the book. It's at minute 13 when she's asked about the book, and she says, oh, we can't get divided. We have to focus on issues like Texas. Well, the reason why Texas is happening is because we don't have a viable political feminist movement that can, have some foresight, that can respond to these issues, that can create networks so that, women in Texas can have access. The white women will usually have the money to fly somewhere else. It's the brown and black women who won't. So, we need to be working on it. But we're not going to be able to work on these issues until we have the discussion that is being avoided, with such stubbornness and obstinacy.
And I think you do a really great job in the book of saying, that you're kind of constantly foregrounding feminism as a critique of capitalist consumerism.
Absolutely.
You have a great critique of the girl boss kind of feminist model.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, not just the girl boss, but also like the Sex and the City model, right? Where, we're not often, we don't see what's being sold to us, right? So one of the critiques I have is that the Sex and the City model is, of course, a consumerist model of feminism, where you just keep buying shoes and, you're a feminist. How cute. And in terms of the girl boss, once again, it's this very individualist, I have to win at all costs. What will this do to my career? Type of attitude. It's, the lean in and the push away. And, I think one of the things that white women lose out on is the kind of sisterhood that I think brown and black and Asian women experience in a more proximate way. When you have had to rely on other people to survive in hostile environments, you develop very strong bonds. But if you continue believing that the only way that you can get ahead is by elbowing everybody else out of the way, or backstabbing, or essentially throwing under the bus, you're not, you never experience sisterhood. And so I would even go on to say that even some of the alienation that a lot of white women experience is because of what this girl boss feminism is doing to them. And and I just want to say to them that there are other ways. There are other ways out there, and you all it takes is for you to be open to them and to sort of be interested in having the conversation.
I'm reminded of how Barbara Smith, the Black lesbian socialist founding member of the Combahee River Collective, says that feminism is not white owned. So they constantly kept making this point of US third world feminisms, women of color feminisms, that food security, like you're saying, food security, wages, having a living wage, medical care, education, all of these are feminist issues.
Absolutely.
And that by narrowing it down to gender parity, or like you say, kind of making it financially, or that I really loved the chapter on sexual liberation as women's empowerment. I think you have this line that says, sexual freedom as the sum total of freedom. So if you wanted to talk a little bit about that before we move to the Q&A, and there are great questions there waiting for us.
So, in the chapter on sexual liberation, where I wrote that sentence, it, came out of my frustration. I mean, I am, 100% supportive of women's sexual liberation. I definitely think that it should be part of the feminist agenda. But I don't, as you said, I don't think it should be the sum total. And the way that sexuality is positioned within American society, in this very, point out, for instance, how it is also mediated in this, what can I buy and how can I perform my, my sexuality in ways that are sort of, corporate structured. So but the critique that I make is the fact that in positioning sexual liberation as the sum total of empowerment, the condescension towards other cultures that might not perform sexuality in the same way, essentially creates a hierarchy where, if you are liberated, you have to perform in, a Carrie Sex and the City kind of way. And if you're not performing in that way, your sexuality, then, there's something wrong with you. Or and especially for brown women, it is immediate assumption that you're insufficiently liberated. Ironically, with Black women, it's the complete opposite, where Black women's sexuality is considered somehow dangerous. Like the example that I give in the book is about dress codes in American high schools, in which young Black girls are punished for violating, dress codes in high school at a rate that's, I think, like 5 times that of white girls. And the reason is what I just said, is that if Black girls are performing sexuality in a way that's not white, it's considered immediately, requiring discipline and being sort of put into the box that whiteness has created for them. And I present the 2 examples is because I want to show that it's not necessarily sexual liberation itself. It's that sexual liberation as is comfortable to white people or white women, that is the key. And so that, when brown women are considered not insufficient or not sufficiently liberated, it's kind of like, let me teach you, how to be. And where Black women are concerned, it's essentially turning around and saying, let me discipline you, because because they are perceived as going in a different direction. So it's not the content of the issue that is at it, that is, in question. It's the ability of whiteness to regulate that issue that is sort of being sold and epitomized as liberation. So yeah, I mean, I present both of those sides in the book, but I also present this idea that sexual liberation can exist without being performative, and this idea that, say, for instance, that a Carrie from New York has so much to teach a Muslim woman from Abu Dhabi or Jordan or whatever, because that other woman doesn't know enough about sexuality. We got to get rid of that. We got to get rid of that stuff because it doesn't facilitate dialogue, and it continues to do what I spoke about at the beginning of the talk, which is it continues to centralize white women. And yeah, that's where I'll stop.
And you have at the end of your author's note at the start of the book that's, there need to be other books similarly written about
absolutely
whiteness
absolutely.
and the LGBTQIA movement, and how, when I teach courses on queer cinema, my students are constantly kind of foregrounding and looking for visibility. So visible sex, visible same sex kind of interactions in films, and you have to kind of alert them to the dangers of that universalizing kind of metrics for what is considered.
But see, that's exactly, and I talk about that in my book, is it's not that people should not have the freedom to have to perform whatever identity they might have. It's just that the sort of deception of performativity is that it almost sort of dupes you into believing that there's substance behind every performative move. And the sad thing is there isn't often substance behind it. The problem, the sort of deception or temptation of it is that when you become too wrapped up in performativity, you forget that there has to be more than just performativity there. And some of that is because we've built a sort of understanding of diversity that is based entirely on recognition and not that recognition and representation aren't important, but as I argue in the book, what we've forgotten is redistribution. And those elements are very crucial to justice. And it's almost as if performativity has kind of duped us to the point that we forget to think about the more kind of concrete struggles that have a redistributive aspect to them.
Or that all performances are legible and should be legible to the white world.
Yes, precisely. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, we have about 25 minutes and a lot of questions, so maybe we could move there. And when we come back, I'd like to also kind of ask you one more question, but let's kind of move to some of these questions that actually overlap with things I wanted to ask you about. There's a lot of praise for the talk, people who've loved the talk. One of the audience members says, Rafia, you're such a powerful role model for young women of color, especially South Asian like myself. My question is, how can or should we respond to white feminists when they express microaggressions towards us? It gets exhausting emotionally to constantly educate them, and it's not necessarily my responsibility to do so. So what do you think?
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you for that compliment. Makes me feel great. And, hey, I have a Substack, so you can join that. But in terms of your question, it's actually a great question, right? Because because that is something that's happening in the real world all the time, is that you face a white microaggression from a white coworker or a white boss. And I think the decision should be up to you. It's absolutely true that it's not your duty or your job, or you're not obligated in any way to do all this educating, because as it was very correctly said, it's very, very emotionally draining. My own, I can only talk about myself, but my personal response to this has been to first consider, I don't want everyone to go quit their job by going into their white feminist boss's office and although, I mean, hey, if you want to do that, that's totally cool. But so you have to first sort of look at it strategically and see how can you do the greatest good. The reason I wrote this book, is in some ways to give a text to women of color, so that they can begin conversations with other people. I wrote the text essentially that I wished I'd had, that I could hand to a lot of white women in my life. But sometimes, responding to these microaggressions is valuable because it's sort of, you are kind of making it easier for other women who, might also work in that environment and who might not have the guts or the position or the power to put a stop to that in that moment. But I guess, you can see even from the tone of the book that I'm a proponent of the talk back, right? And of being firm and but very clear about why a certain action that they think is cute and they think is something that they're giving you a lot of that they're sort of recognizing you or something. People sometimes are awkward and they don't understand the harm that they cause. And so in that sense, I mean, I think it's important to stop them, but not to the point that never to the point that it depletes you further. Because listen, a lot of white women are like, well, this is an uncomfortable book to read. And it is an uncomfortable book to read. But what I always say to them is that the discomfort that you might feel reading this book is the discomfort that Brown, Black, Asian women feel 100% of the time, because they're constantly having to perform whiteness to be acceptable to you, to not seem threatening, to not seem offended, to essentially have the right to exist. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and to weigh that discomfort versus the real violence that white feminism does in the world, right?
Absolutely.
Combine two questions from audience members. One said, I found your Amnesty International board experience so interesting. What are some examples of nonprofits or other organizations that have actually been doing a good job of being truly inclusive and not only centering white women or white feminism? And another audience member asks a similar question saying, are there international NGOs that get it right in the way that they support women and avoid the pitfalls of white feminism? Or do you have a few favorite smaller NGOs that you support in any country that supports women?
Oh, now this is a really good question. And first of all, like I said, I'm very open in talking about that experience within Amnesty, but it's also true that that organization, I mean, they do work hard, but there's a systemic problem here, and the systems are very old and it's very hard to change them. And it's very hard for people to understand that when you bring in someone who doesn't have the, isn't white, middle-aged, and middle class, that they speak in a different way, they listen in a different way. They, for instance, I would have this situation where I would make a proposal, for something XYZ, whatever. And I would make a proposal. For instance, let's have the board do an anti-drone action, right? We were against, at the time, Obama was droning Pakistan and Afghanistan. Let's have an action against that. And there would be crickets. Nobody saying anything, right? And then quite literally an hour later, someone else would make the exact same suggestion and would be like, that's such a fantastic idea. That's so interesting. And the reason why I'm saying this example right now is that white people don't listen when Black and they might let them speak, but they're not listening because within the larger calculus, it's assumed that, okay, I put you here. Now, if someone sees a picture of the board, they'll see your face and, diverse, yay. But I don't have to listen to you. I mean, you're only here because you're brown. You're only here because you're brown and Muslim and a woman. That's 100% the assumption that accompanies you all the time. Now, in terms of the NGOs, I don't have any good news. I'll give you a statistic that will tell you how bad the problem is. Of the largest 10 NGOs in the world, right? Of the boards of those NGOs, less than 2% of people on those boards are even from countries that receive aid. Now, just think about that. It's not even that these people are, that they themselves have ever received aid. It's like you could have the richest person in India be one of these boards, but no. It's all people from the white and Western world. Less than 2% are even from a country that has received aid. Now, when you have that statistic, international NGOs are doing terribly. And, I think that I'm not going to tell people, donate to this, donate to that, but I am going to say that whoever you donate to, look at their board and say, even if you're just donating $50, ask them, write a message saying, I would like to donate, but I noticed that none of
spoke about how so one of the audience members says, I appreciate the conversation about how women of color can also be and practice white feminism, can be white feminists and practice white feminism, much like how Rafia Zakaria says that white women need to talk to white women. I'm motivated to do the same, but I feel like a killjoy, especially because the products cater to brown folks are veiled in inclusion, but end up being about the same consumerist capitalist norms.
I mean, look, in terms of being a killjoy, you have to say it like it is. You just really have to say it like it is. And if that is, people consider that, I would even go as far to say that the idea that we should all be happy and positive and like just, always like kumbaya, like that's a very white feminist idea, because it essentially functions and is fed by the premise that we all just have to pretend we're white to get along, right? So I have no qualms about being a killjoy personally. I mean, because I just feel that we are at such an inflection point that if we don't bluntly start saying that this is the problem, and I need you to help me solve it rather than be an obstacle, we're never going to get anywhere. The post-COVID world is very, very hostile to women. It is hostile, it's going to become more hostile and more ruthless. And I think that, unless we kind of acknowledge that and acknowledge the urgency of now, we're not going to be able to push through. We'll essentially have given up on feminism as a movement, at least.
Absolutely. There's a question asking, what do you see as the relationship between white feminism and neoliberal capitalism? Would it not be more accurate to describe it as feminist capitalism or white feminist capitalism? Are the examples you've spoken about not merely a part of individualistic social capitalism, where feminism itself is merely a means to an end, the expansion of markets and increased capital, both financial and social, to maintain the status quo and get ahead in the world?
That is some of it, but the reason why I would not say that is simple. And that reason is that whiteness is an immutable characteristic. I could be the richest brown person in the world, have all sorts of capitalist resources. But when I walk into a room, people don't say, I walk into a room where nobody knows me. I'm not going to be judged on any of those achievements or whatever, power I might have in terms of wealth or class. I'm going to be understood in terms of my skin color. And, I see a lot of this critique. I especially see people who have grown up poor and white say things like that. And I tell them that, look, yes, you might have experienced other forms of discrimination and oppression that we might have in common in terms of class, etc. But when you walk into a room, you're still white. And that confers a privilege all its own that, Black and brown people just don't have. And so, yes, there is the consumerist capitalist component, but even the poorest white person has white privilege because of their skin color and because of the the privileges that have been afforded to that skin color. It's easier for them to move out of poverty. It's easier for them to figure out how to get that scholarship to college. It's easier for them to, separate them from the small town provincial outlook that they might have had. It's far, far harder for a brown person, and especially a Black person in the United States, it's almost as if like the presumption is against you. When you walk into the room, the presumption is this is a brown person with whom I will have very little in common, and they're very low relatability scale. Because all the experiences they've ever had with every and any other brown person, what they've seen in the movies, what they've seen on The Simpsons, all of that walks in before me. And then it's up to me to then break all of that down and try to make people actually see me as an individual. And I think that white people, even the poorest ones of them, they just don't have to do that.
And also in the book, you talk about how closely whiteness is imbricated with capitalism, with colonialism, neo-colonialism. So
Absolutely.
if you wanted to spend a few minutes, for example, talking about Afghanistan, some of the most powerful parts of the book are on Afghanistan. And I know you've spoken more recently, even after the book has come out and the so-called withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. This whole thing has been cloaked as white feminist gifts to the Middle East of feminism, right? But the taking of democracy, of US-style democracy, I've heard Afghan and Haitian feminists recently on the news saying, leave us to sort out our own countries, to sort out both our kind of democratic political forms as well as our feminist forms. We'll come up with our own forms in relation to the histories that we have had instead of these imposed white Western forms. And some of the questions ask about that as well. So maybe we could spend some time.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely they're saying that. And the reason why they're saying that is because white feminists presided over the delegitimation of feminism in almost the whole Muslim world, but especially in Afghanistan. And I'll tell you exactly how that happened, is that even before 9/11 happened, Feminist Majority, which is one of the biggest women's organizations, feminist organizations in the United States, was carrying out a campaign against Wales in Afghanistan on behalf of Afghan women, right? And this campaign came to the attention of some Hollywood celebrities who then started to have a big fundraiser around this issue. Now, this is kind of, the campaign was taking off, 9/11 happened, right? 9/11 happened and the Bush administration needed a sort of moral cover to put to what was essentially a revenge war, right? I mean, these people had refuge, Osama and company, refuge in Afghanistan. The Taliban gave them refuge. So now we're going to get back at them. Ironically, not by bombing Saudi Arabia, which is where all of them are from, but we need the Saudi oil, so we're just going to go bomb Afghanistan because that's like easy to bomb into the Stone Age. It's like a poor country, a landlocked poor country, and so that was this. They literally asked Feminist Majority for their advice and co-opted their campaign. I mean, just think, Feminist Majority leaders, were actually present when Colin Powell made the announcement for war in Afghanistan. And then we all know what happens next, right? There's all this performativity around the veil and how we're going to take women over, free them from the veil, because of course, Afghan women are monolith, and that's their one problem. And once that's done, it's all taken care of. But point being is that, Feminist Majority actually went to the point of, and I believe now as well, went to the point of issuing a press release hailing the invasion of Afghanistan. Gloria Steinem said that she supports bringing democracy to Afghanistan, right? I mean, and this went on for years and years and years and years. And I'll give you the very concrete example of how little good faith there was in this. And that is the fact that, the US, this is like 4 years ago, 5 years ago. So it's not even in the initial stages. USAID implemented a $400 million program that was supposed to empower and uplift Afghan women. $400 million. And this was also supposed to give like 8,000 to 10,000 Afghan women job training, okay? And when the US Inspector General, so this is a US government agency, audited this program, you know how many women benefited and got job training? Like 3 or 4. $400 million. And USAID could not account for where the rest of the money had gone. So there you have it, right? And in terms of what these women are saying now to leave us to it, of course they're saying that. They're saying that because you tied feminism up with bombs in a single package, okay? So now, to the point that now any talk of empowerment is considered traitorous because it's considered that, oh, well, you agreed to the bombing of your own country, so I'm going to be against you. And if you're a feminist, I'm definitely going to be against that. So, and mind you, when feminist majority was supporting the Bush administration in that initial push to war, the Afghan women's organizations on the ground, like RAWA, for instance, were begging the Bush administration to not invade their country. But did anyone listen to them? No. And so now they have to do the absolutely uphill task of regaining some legitimacy for women's empowerment in Afghanistan. They have to show that, they care actually about the women and they don't care about the US or whatever. And one of the reasons for writing this book is because I was so caught up with this problem of, how are Muslim women, Afghan women, Pakistani women going to make women's empowerment an authentic and indigenous topic within their countries so that they can have the space to actually help solve the on the ground problems. I mean, in Afghanistan and Pakistan, shelters are a huge issue. And the idea of finding a place where women can go for safety are a huge issue. And, so far, the only people who have successfully been able to allow women to, some kind of shelter are ironically these very right-wing religious schools. And that's not how it should be. So the cost of, Western and white feminists allying with US and NATO state interests, in bombing Afghanistan, mean that task is so hard. It's so hard. I can tell you because I speak to these women on a daily basis almost, and the struggles before them are gargantuan. There's really no, and of course, like everybody, everyone in the West has already forgot.
Because you enter and withdraw at will. And after having dismantled kind of historical indigenous structures and frameworks. We are at time, Rafia. I wanted to thank you so much for this wonderful talk. We have so many people in the Q&A thanking you. I liked this comment which says, Rafia, thanks for giving a voice to an often hard to articulate real experience. So a lot of feminists of color thanking you for your book.
Thank you so much. And if you have questions that didn't get answered, please feel free to post them on my Substack. It's Rafia Unedited on, and you can just Google it and it'll come up. I find these discussions extremely generative in continuing to think about these issues. And, obviously I'm a columnist, so these are issues that I think and, want to write about. So if you have anything, you can email me. My email is rafia.zakaria@gmail.com. So just my first name and last name with a period in the middle. This was an incredible discussion, really, really, made me think through a lot of the central issues of the book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafia. Thank you so much, Usha. That was a fantastic discussion. We will also, to those of you in the audience, if your question didn't get answered or your comment, because we had lots of great comments as well, we can send all those to Rafia through the magic that is Zoom. So
yeah, I would love that.
Everything will be sent to you, but thank you also for letting us know of your Substack, Rafia Unedited. To our audience members, we have another event on Thursday morning. We are co-sponsoring an event in Afghanistan. It's at 9:30 in the morning Pacific time. There's going to be a slide after we are all taken off the screen, and that will have the details. That will also have all our social media and our website, southasia.stanford.edu. You can sign up for our mailing list and find out about everything that we do. But this has been a fantastic event. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.